if you're pre-revenue, it's hard to really talk on revenue, but are you solving a problem that actually needs to be solved? That's, I would say, it's the one question. If there isn't really a problem that you're solving, then it's going to be really hard to to gain investment unless you just have strong connections. But even then, there could be an end to the runway at a certain point if you don't have a problem that you're solving. There are some really serious problems in music. One of them, and I think this might be the greatest failing of our generation, is
Welcome to BPM, Behind People in Music, the podcast where we go beyond the stage, past the headlines, and straight into the real stories of the people who make the music industry run. I'm your host, Nate Abrahams, a senior at Indiana University and an executive member of the Business of Music Club here at IU. I started this podcast because I wanted my generation to get access to the kind of conversations you never hear in a classroom or on TikTok. Real, unfiltered conversations with the people who have been there, done it, and are still shaping the music industry. Today, I'm joined by Noah Itman, Chief Revenue Officer at Digital Music News, one of the most influential music business publications in the world, reaching millions of readers and shaping industry conversations every single day. Noah has helped turn the platform from a small passion project into a multi-million-dollar media business and one of the most influential voices in music, tech, and entertainment. By the end of this episode, you will walk away with three things: a behind-the-scenes understanding of how music media and music business actually works, clarity on how narratives and coverage shape careers and companies, and practical advice for building a career in music. So, let's get into it. Hey Noah, thank you so much for joining the BPM podcast today. I really appreciate you coming on.
my pleasure, Nate. I'm super excited to be here.
Yeah, well, I am excited for this conversation. I think the way we met is very unique in that I had initially reached out to you to see if we can get my former management company out into the world somehow. So I think this is a cool full circle moment for sure.
It certainly is. And I think that there's going to be some interesting anecdotes that come from that initial experience to translate into this interview. So I'm excited.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'll get straight into it. I kind of want to start a little broadly on the media side, and I'm curious if there's something from your perspective that the music industry gets wrong about how the media actually works and the behind the scenes of it.
I would say that the biggest thing, it's not as though it's that the industry's getting it wrong. It's probably just like the general consumers that also happen to be in the music industry, but it's time constraints. And there's this kind of assumption of, hey, I sent you something. Can you just copy paste it? And there are sites that will do that, but a lot of sites that are more journalistic rather than kind of like a repository of content, they're going to need to allocate a writer to that, as they're not typically going to just say copy paste, let's put this out. There's going to need to be some investigation, some research, and also just putting it into the DMN, for us, Digital Music News vernacular. And I think that the gap between the expectation and reality there is the biggest thing that I would ever comment on, being a little bit of a difference of expectation versus reality.
Yeah, could you expand a little bit on expectation versus reality?
Yeah, I mean, it's really down to there's this kind of, and not everybody has this, but assumption of, hey, we have news. A lot of times people will misconstrue news versus company updates. And so with a publication like Digital Music News, we're a very small company. We have two writers plus our publisher, a couple of other like freelance writers that we'll work with as well. But if we're going to cover a company's promotional announcement, let's say a company drops a new product or service, then we have to take a writer off of something, which might be a deep investigation of the Ticketmaster scandal or of an investment that's occurring. We have to pull them off of that and put them onto this other announcement. And oftentimes these are solicited through public relation firms that are being paid, and it's simply them sending us an advertisement that we're not getting paid for. So there's oftentimes a gap there between expectations of, hey, I've got this news item, it's really interesting. But when we view it, it's really more of a promotional announcement that isn't news per se, whereas we consider something to be news, which very subjective term, to be things that have a potential effect on the at least a plurality, if not majority, of digital music news' readers.
Right. Is there a way that you guys have found to correctly balance between those two? And, I'm sure all platforms are doing it differently and have different priorities in what they're pushing out and how they're making money too. But I'm curious how you guys specifically are balancing that.
What we really do is just create a commercial offering so that companies still have this outlet, the ability to share news with our audience or share updates in this case, but through the lens of working with digital music news to help get this message out there. I also work very closely with the brands that we partner with to make sure that their message is as salient to our readers as possible, which I consider to be very important because there's going to be a difference in result if a company just does a blanket announcement, we've released this product, versus really digging into the why behind that product and kind of dissecting what it does in many cases, especially if it's a new type of, let's say, like royalty administration that needs to be explained and interpreted to the readers.
Hmm. Do Are there specific stories that you'll look at, either that will come to you or that you guys find and it's pretty clear that one should get more attention and one shouldn't, or maybe in general also, in music news, are there stories that you see that maybe shouldn't get the attention that they do and other stories that don't get attention that maybe should?
It's so subjective that it's hard to make like a blanket statement about that. However, I'll say that in terms of digital music news compared to other publications, we don't tend to focus as much on like the music itself. We don't really write reviews very often of albums. I think that that's because our audience is a little bit upstream. They're not fans. Well, they are fans of music in the sense that they work in music, they love music, but they're people who are typically decision makers or professional music makers themselves or people that are on the teams of professional music makers. And so their focus is less on music discovery than it is on industry practices, deals, mergers, acquisitions, things like that. Things that spell bottom line growth. And that can be like a catalog deal. If I'm an artist and I see a similar artist have a catalog deal, that might mean something substantial to me. That doesn't mean that who's dating who doesn't matter or it should get less coverage, but there is certainly less of an emphasis around that here. That said, there's always going to be a little bit of a tug of war internally about that because some topics there are that are out there. I certainly feel passionately ought to be covered more extensively. There are some independent artists that I think we can certainly profile them, help expose them to the major label system from what we're perceiving as a larger opportunity. That's just like something that we've talked about internally. There isn't any action on it at this point, but there are definitely always ways that we're talking about editorial and journalism and ways that we can kind of like hit more bases.
Yeah. For that perspective on, digital music news targeting more of the people up the line, the executives, people deep in the music industry, looking more at bottom line growth versus music discovery, is that, and then looking at the other platforms like that do show, who's dating who and some of the more dramatic things within the industry, is there, specific stories or even specific platforms that you would say control the narrative in music and like these stories that create all this drama?
I don't know that there really is. There's certainly like niches. I'm sure that there are probably like really big communities of just like general K-pop fans, and those communities probably have a lot of influence over K-pop, at least in terms of market research. Where Hybe, Big Hit, and SM, they're probably looking at those platforms and saying, "Hey, what should we invest in terms of A&R?" But I don't know if there's necessarily like any gatekeepers in that sense.
Yeah. Do you see it changing over time? Maybe more influences coming from different places or something that coming up through the industry as, somebody soon to graduate college like myself and a lot of our other viewers, is there something that we can be looking for maybe in changes in that kind of stuff?
It's a tough question to answer just because I don't exactly know. all of the different triggers that could be leveraged by the IP decision makers, because that's really what we're looking at is like how do we influence major labels and publishers more so for catalog and labels for newer releases, things that are either happening now or going to be happening. I think that the biggest thing is just understanding trends. We have a great partnership with the company Chartmetric, which is very good at dissecting trends within the music industry. And I think that they have a lot of influence, but understanding their platform is going to give you a leg up, certainly. And I'd always recommend any student who wants to get more involved in music to understand that. For those who don't know, Chartmetric is it's like data and analytics on music. It's you want to know how many streams this person has, what their social following is, etc. Tools like that are used very heavily by A&R, and I think that that is really the biggest influence. And all of this comes down to the core of the industry, which is to make money. It is a capitalist society that we live in, and music is just a part of that. It's not like it's because of music, but companies are very focused on retaining their investments and earning from them. So if they can know that putting this much money into artist X will have a predictable return of Y, then they're more likely to do that.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. I appreciate the the advice. I think it's great advice. Chart metric, I think, is a really important tool to understand. I'd love to use that, I guess, to transition into more about your background and the way that you approached, coming into the industry and now being the chief revenue officer of Digital Music News.
Thank you. So prior to anything with my professional life, I really have to thank my mom for getting me into music. She brought me to see REM when I was 5, the Smashing Pumpkins when I was 6. The influence of music has been huge throughout my life. I even have the Replacements poster behind me because while it wasn't like she was involved with their team, she did help them get their first concert for more than like 100 or so people. And their career, they may not be the biggest name that you've heard of, but I guarantee somebody listening to this has heard the Replacements and is a fan of theirs. They're big enough for that, at least. That's been ingrained into my DNA. And then after finishing college, I started my own company. And the ambition of that was to help music that I thought was really good, that was getting just kind of ignored by the label system, helping elevate that. I was in Minneapolis, with had an incredible rock and roll scene, and it historically a fantastic hip hop scene as well. Lots of genres that are very strong in the Twin City area, but I just fell in love with so many different artists there from their music, not on a person to person basis, but such great music that was being created. I created a platform that the ambition of it was to create a direct to consumer distribution, but also a collaborative workspace for people to upload partial works, other people finish it. There's shared monetization. I didn't have the funds to build that. So, what I ended up building was something more like SoundCloud, but with monetization for sales that you could set your own prices, keep 100%. And this was before SoundCloud had monetization. So, there was some unique elements. We were the first, and I don't know if there was any others after that, but in your web player, being able to play 24-bit lossless audio, there was a lot of really cool stuff that I was excited about for my company. It was called It Music, but it didn't succeed. And a big part of that was I didn't understand marketing. I put a lot of money into Facebook ads, not realizing that it was driving absolutely no return. And the model just wasn't going to have success in the long run anyway, because outside of marketing, there wasn't a way for me or It Music to make money. And understanding that was a really big kind of like learning experience. After I realized that there was not going to be a future there, I started waiting tables, and now still back in suburban Minneapolis. And while waiting tables, I started applying to every job I could. A guy that I was hanging out with by the name of Patrick told me about this guy, Ari Herstand, that he followed on Facebook, that I think that they may have been friends before, but he said, hey, he just posted this job. He works for this company called Digital Music News. I read it here and there, but they're looking for like a sales guy, and you seem like you know a lot about sales. So I applied to that job. I didn't know anybody, and the founder, Paul Resnikoff, it was a very extensive interview process. It lasted several months. Uh,
Oh wow.
Paul was still consulting full time. Digital Music News was not a full time job for anybody at this time. So there was a really big risk in accepting this role and moving. I packed up my sedan. I moved from suburban Minneapolis down to Santa Monica, California. But here I am close to 11 years later. It's worked out exceptionally well.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think that's a very interesting way to get into this industry, and I think waiting tables is a very important part of it. As I think it is for everybody that idea of having to be social and work with people, and I think everybody has to work in a restaurant at some point.
Well,
I'd love you know now being at Digital Music News, that transition from that learning process at It Music. I'm curious what then changed when you joined Digital Music News. If there was a perspective change or a strategic change, maybe that you brought this new approach to Digital Music News.
so the company really never had sales before me, and that was a huge thing that I changed. And prior to even my own finishing college, I was selling TVs for Sears, and that was when I identified how to sell things well, and I realized that a lot of people sell things because they're supposed to sell things rather than because the person who's buying stuff needs something. I think that
Mhm.
that understanding was a really helpful asset for Digital Music News because when I stepped into my role at Digital Music News, I had no B2B experience. I had no advertising sales experience. I'd never worked for a publication. I'd never even really had a real out of college job other than my own company that I founded, which being the boss, it was not a lot of structure, I can tell you. So jumping into Digital Music News was a huge learning experience. I remember in the early days reaching out to some companies. I was just basically like, searching through people that I knew that had any involvement with music. And there was a friend of my family who had done some radio promotion. I got in contact with him. I made a very small sale in the hundreds of dollars. That was my first little like notch in my belt that I had made a sale in the first few days. Really good feeling from that. But then, in terms of what I brought to Digital Music News, they had been earning about $20,000 a year, and that was at like a high point. Paul Resnikoff is the founder. He had been running Digital Music News since I think 2002, three or four, something like that. And it was really just companies that would come in and say, "Hey, can I pay you this much to put something in your newsletter?" To which he might say yes or no to. So they would make sometimes less than 20,000, sometimes around 20,000. When I joined the company in the first 6 months, they earned 50,000, and that was when I transitioned from being a contractor to being an employee on a W-2 basis. And then after that, it has just been continuous growth, and it's always a really interesting thing to understand these small independent companies because with Digital Music News, when I first joined, Paul was still consulting in the weekends. He switched his schedule. He used to do consulting on the weekdays, and then he would go up to the Bay Area for a company he was consulting on the weekends. That switched. He started doing DMN on the weekdays, the consulting on the weekends, swapping that around, and eventually just stopped consulting because DMN had become a company that was now able to employ more people. It's been really, really great to be at a small company. Even just having read the news yesterday, Penske Media, who owns Billboard, Rolling Stone, The Hollywood Reporter, and Music Business Worldwide, they're doing some pretty substantial layoffs. Not in the hundreds, but for the teams of their size, still pretty substantial. The nice thing about companies the size of Digital Music News, which is under 10 people, you'll never get laid off because you're always essential, assuming that you're providing value.
Yeah, yeah. I'd love to sort of stay on the business path for a second, and I'm curious, especially when you started out, but I think also now, how did you approach this idea of Digital Music News is offering this product? How can we differentiate ourselves from other news platforms that other companies might want to be a part of as well?
Well, I had to build it all from scratch. There wasn't like a sales vehicle. There wasn't like prices that existed. I just kind of had to like look out there and make stuff up as I went along in terms of pricing and what we offered. I also had to spearhead a redesign of our website because the way it used to work is that you could only see like a few articles on the front door. There was no page two to content on DMN. You had to either see what was on the front door or search for it. So getting an idea of like how to price. There was a little bit of a competitive surveying, but I really wanted to make things approachable for startups because of my own failures as a startup. I wanted to make sure that our pricing wasn't so high. When you go out there and you look at trade publications, there's Music Business Worldwide is one of them, Billboard. Music Business Worldwide was just starting then, so I couldn't use them as a comparison. What I was looking at was like Ad Age, Digiday, at that point, Billboard for their physical media, which was their business related product at the time. And they were charging in the $50 to $75 CPM range, which seemed very unattainable for most companies to get more than like a handful of his views. So I really focused on the pricing that social media was doing and tried to compete at that level. And it's been able to generate way more companies coming through our door. It's not as prohibitive so that there aren't only like one or two advertisers at a time. We've seen hundreds upon hundreds of companies grow because of our low barrier to entry, but we also have a very high level of qualification. We won't work with companies that are not having artists or music companies' best interests at heart. And so there is like a little bit of vetting that happens as well. It's not just low cost, come on in. There has to be a very high level of intentionality. I want to be seen by the music industry, not just by people in general. Otherwise, there isn't really much reason to work with us.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier that, one of the things that you struggled with at music was the marketing side of it. How did you strategize marketing to the audience that you wanted to target, which, as you mentioned, is more specific than just, the general people?
It was really just through process of failure and understanding that. I remember going into Facebook and targeting musicians, not realizing that when it said several hundred million people, that's probably more than the people who are making income from music. And that's been that was really a huge learning experience from the It Music days until now. Understanding that among the millions upon millions of people that make music in the United States, for example, there's a couple 100,000 people that make money from their music, at least like materially. They don't have to work other jobs within that group, you're not going to be reaching that targeted professional level because Facebook does not know the difference between somebody whose income is sustained through music and like me who just plays guitar and I have fun on the weekends with it. They don't know the
Yeah,
difference. And so knowing context, if you look at digital music news as content, it's exceptionally boring if you're not trying to make money in music. It's like this company invested in this company, this guy's suing this guy. It's really not interesting unless you need to know that information. And that's a really nice way of sequestering out people that don't matter to your bottom line.
interesting. Do you ever see that business model changing in the future, or was there ever a time where you had been with digital music news for a little bit and there had to be a business model shift because something wasn't working or you wanted to adjust it in some way?
One of the nice things about being at a small company is that I adjust things constantly. I'm always adding new products. We added things like custom webinars. I'll now insert quotes into articles. It's an always evolving thing based on essentially what I think a company needs, whether that is a really heavy level of content marketing. In many cases now, what we're starting to offer is disintermediation from public relations firms because very often people will, as I mentioned earlier, pay these PR firms and it's like 8 to 10 grand a month to send emails to publications like us. And realistically, we're just going to delete those emails and not out of any malice. It's just because it's like I mentioned before, it's that separation between expectation and reality. But now,
Right.
with a lot of companies, we will serve as their public relations firm in the sense that we will write up all of their content, we'll blast it out, and through press wire services. So even our competitive websites are picking up these news stories.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's cool. I thinking of it as like a PR for companies is interesting, and I think I haven't really heard that perspective before, and I really like it. That this idea, and I think it's unique to digital music news, and you guys do a really great job of like you were saying, you know this importance of understanding the business behind the music industry and how it does not interest all audiences but is vital to a lot of the people that you're reaching in that specific audience. And so I guess moving into more broad media, especially looking into the future, I'm curious how TikTok and Instagram and even AI is affecting overall media, but also specifically digital music news, and how you guys approach, releasing information about companies and the changes that they're going through, and how to make sure that you're staying, true to yourselves and giving out the best information that you can.
So the way that I would say AI is affecting us most is that it's giving us a lot to write about. There's lawsuits, there's deals happening. We actually made an intentional choice to not block AI crawlers early on, and as a result, we index really well in AI search. And part of that is that we don't feel as threatened because the way that AI training works, it's not really stuff that's happening today. It's general knowledge. How do I get my publishing rights in order? Even then, I would really double check anything that it tells you because its answers may change there. In terms of like just indexing stories, we're not as concerned about AI stealing the breaking news category of what deals are happening today because it's also less likely, I think, for people to be sitting on ChatGPT and saying what are the deals happening in music today rather than just reading it. It's actually easier just to read about it and not have to ask questions and prompt it. That, and also because of the training, there's a delay. I don't know what the latest training date for ChatGPT is, but I assume it's at least a year or two old. Just on the general knowledge, it can search, of course, but for what it just has in its databases. TikTok and Instagram, totally different story. We leverage Instagram to some extent for just sharing stuff from digital music news. We don't have a TikTok account. Maybe we should. We just don't have enough people to operate one at this point. But there is certainly a reason to do that in the future. In the last couple of years, we started doing a lot more video content with some of our partners, and splicing
Mm,
that up to put it out on TikTok would make sense if we just find somebody to help us with that in the next phase of the business. Uh, in terms of just like the macro of how it's affecting the industry, a lot of people have talked about like the TikTokification of music. There's always going to be trends. I think that what that means is that there's just really snappy hooks in some songs, and I don't mind a snappy hook, so that's not a bad thing per se.
yeah. Is there a good way to differentiate between real and fake news? I think a snappy hook is a good example of not not changing the story, but giving it more of an interesting title. But I think sometimes that they can be misleading or fake, and I'm curious if there's a way to differentiate between the two.
I guess just comparing like resources. I don't know if I run into many like fake news stories, at least in the like the zeitgeist of what fake news means. What I probably run into is sponsored content that uses crafty wording. Like an example of that could be like Company X has an ambitious plan to change the music industry. And maybe that could be said as like Company X is changing the music industry. And I don't know if I would call that fake news as much as just promotional media. And you have to just be smart and read that with a discerning eye. In terms of like the generative AI, is this story fake overall? I would say if you're careful about where it's published, we're not going to publish stuff written by AI. I don't think any other major trade publications would either. And so that helps safeguard a lot. If you find a story on a site you've never heard of and then you look at other sites that you do trust, that's probably a really good way of just like testing out to see if that has any legitimacy.
Yeah. Being a company that is open to, stories, and companies will reach out to you and ask, including mine, to be written about, or for a story to be written about them. And maybe this hasn't happened, but how can you know if what they're telling you is true or not?
We look into it. We don't just take things at face value. So
Mhm.
for that to happen, let's say you were using your own company as an example. If you're reaching out, you do management representation for artists. There's just probably not going to be much of a response in terms of news coverage unless there's like a big story. And then let's say you flip that and said, "Hey, this artist that I had just sold out the biggest festival in the world, and nobody had ever heard of them. We're going to look into that and see if the ticket sales correlate. Hey, can you send us some screenshots to show us that information? We're going to do our own independent research outside of what we discuss. All of those things that we talk about will need to be verified." And on the negative side of things, so like there's companies reaching out that want coverage. There's also companies or individuals that reach out and say, "Hey, this company's doing something that you ought to look into, and it's not a good
Mm,
thing." That compels a lot of research. We're not the type of publication that says sources confirmed that, or many close to this are saying that this is the case. we will reach out and request comment. And if we don't get one, we leave enough time for them to respond. An example of that could have been some writing that I did this past year about publishing fraud that I was uncovering. In that, I reached out to the MLC, to all of the collection societies, really just understanding what was happening here. Was the publishing administrator. If you wouldn't mind taking their name out, though, just there was a publishing administrator that a lot of these works were registered towards. I reached out to them to get information on if they were able to make a comment. I shared with them the information that I had thus far. I wasn't hiding anything. I was just sharing, hey, this is something that I'm working on. I'm trying to get to the bottom of this so that the industry knows about it. If they want to respond, they're able to, but there is nothing that is just going to like come out as a surprise because we need to reach out and get a comment and get both sides of the story. We treat things really careful when it comes to anything that could be considered as defamatory.
Yeah. Is there another situation or a time where you did publish a story that ended up creating an issue or that you had to take down in you know at any time?
There was kind of a funny one. It was an April Fool's article, which we haven't done in a couple of years, but it was an April Fool's article. I think it was saying like Google to buy Tidal or something. This was in 2016, 2017, so it was shortly after Jay-Z had been really publicly involved in Tidal. And we did
Hmm.
get a letter from the attorneys on behalf of Jay-Z that they were just like, hey, cease and desist. But we pointed out, hey, this is really clear in the article. This is an April Fool's joke. Please don't take it seriously. And we never heard another peep about it, so we didn't have to remove anything. There haven't really been too many other instances. I think that because our publisher is very strong minded, we also tend to not back down from things. And there were even cases from before I joined the company where we were helping to uncover piracy and fraud that was occurring with some companies that were doing early streaming. And the unwillingness to take those stories down, it was very valuable in the sense of helping these IPs be protected. Plenty of information on that on Digital Music News if you look up Robert Fripp.
Awesome. Well, I'd love to take sort of pieces of what we've talked to and connect it to like revenue and business models in the music industry as a whole. And so, from your perspective, I'm curious where the money within the industry, and I want to like target media and news in music, and I'm curious where the money really comes from, not just from digital music news specifically, because I think you guys have a specific business model. But I think is that a business model that is common in music industry news, and then if there are others, what are the main ways to make money?
I don't know if our approach is actually that common. Direct sales for advertising on websites is not common currently. There are a couple of other sites that are doing it, but I think that it's a lot less often than using things like ad networks or programmatic advertising. But I realized early on with digital music news that like Google Ads, all of these other, you get reached out to by them constantly if you operate a publication. These ad networks pay a lot less than they will ever promise. They'll tell you it's this CPM, it ends up being that CPM. And you often don't know what that is until it's on your site. And sometimes they have like malicious code. So we've really avoided programmatic, but a lot of other websites can make it work, especially websites with high traffic. If you were to look at a consumer facing music news site that's doing like album reviews, talking about festivals, I would have said Pitchfork, but I don't know if Pitchfork still exists. So like I don't know what the best example here is, but sites that have a larger, maybe Rolling Stone is a good example. Rolling Stone's
Mm-hmm.
for fans of music. They're probably mostly using, and even Billboard, because Billboard's not B2B anymore. They're probably mostly using like display network ads instead of direct sold ads. I think that in their business side, they're still direct selling, but in their just general billboard.com, it's probably mostly programmatic.
Yeah. Do you see any business models, like you mentioned, that are underrated or that are maybe overrated and starting to die off?
Yeah, I genuinely those programmatic ads I think are very overrated, and the less that they get used, the better. But you'll see them a lot if you're just like searching the web generally. Places where you can find them a lot are like high search based sites. Like some, I play video games, and if you look up a video game walkthrough, you're going to find a lot of programmatic ads in any of the sites that you land on for like how to do this in a video game. It'll be ones where like when you're scrolling, like the ad looks different, like it scrolls in an interesting way. Sometimes these ads can be like really nice and dynamic looking, but those are generally these programmatic ads. And I do think that they're overrated just because of how little they pay. They're going off tonnage. These are sites that get 20, 30, 40 times the readership that DMN has. So it can make sense for them financially. But I do think that if they had dedicated salespeople, they could make a lot more money and have higher quality experiences for their readers. I also think that from an industry trend perspective, I'm really not for social media advertising just because of the issues that I stated earlier, the issues in targeting. But I also think that there's a lot of ethical concerns, especially with social media perpetuating a lot of disinformation, a lot of stuff that is a net negative on society, and the ability to promote things that are, you talked about fake news, you can just hop on there, write a fake news story, and promote it as though it's real news. And I think that there's not only a consumer backlash to that, but also just a little bit of appeal away from wanting to participate in those systems. And then we look at like the theories of AI becoming so pervasive on platforms like Facebook, and then you have to wonder who's actually even seeing your stuff. Is it just AI bots? Are they real people? What's the targeting looking like? I think that those are becoming less popular, which is nice to see. Influencer marketing, it kind of like goes up and down. There's always trends along that, but I think that there's fewer influencers in the music industry that have a lot of traction, and so it's not something that I've really dug super deep into. There's certainly some that are out there, some podcasters, but none that have amassed like none that like kind of own the vertical.
Yeah. Can you expand a little bit on if you see there being any underrated business models in making money and then also in advertising? I think social media is definitely sort of a scary line to balance on because anybody can post anything about anything. But do you see there being a method of advertisement that is, less used but should be used more often?
I mean, maybe radio, just because, like, I don't know a lot of people talking about radio advertising, and there is still a contingency of people who use it. It just depends on who you want to reach. Like, if
Yeah.
you want to reach people that are of a certain demographic that you know is on that social platform, go for it. It's all about targeting, though. And I think that that's the biggest thing. Like, when I sell digital music news, what I'm selling is not the number of people that read us, it's who those people are. I
Hmm.
think that if you understand where your target audience is, that can really inform your advertising decisions. But even like more broadly than that, things that are underrated, it's really hard to kind of like to say that more broadly speaking, just because I don't know everything that's out there. Um,
Right.
there are definitely some really good events to be at. Even then, I would say being at those events is probably sufficient rather than advertising during them. This is all very subjective, though, based off of my own very biased anecdotes.
Yeah. I think this might also be a little subjective, but you had mentioned a bit earlier about working with startups and being interested in talking about them on digital music news. And I'm curious, sticking with this business model idea, is there something that you see in startups? I think in general, not specifically for management versus agency versus media, but something that you see in music industry startups that help them continue to grow, or something that they're doing that is making them successful versus the ones that are collapsing.
Yeah, understanding where their audience is and understanding the value of awareness. This is something that I talk about a lot with prospective partners, but let's say you're a distribution company. Distribution is a very competitive field, and distribution is something that musicians need, not want. When it gets to the point of which distributor they're choosing, if you're not one of those top few names like DistroKid, TuneCore, Two Lost, if you're not one of those companies, then it's really hard to become a part of the consideration because most artists are not going to, every time they have a new release, search what are the new distributors and what separates them. They're probably going to go off of what they know, what they've heard a lot about. And we've done a lot of work with great distributors and understanding how to build up that mind share. It is a challenge for a lot of startups because there's kind of this like newer mentality behind advertising of like you have to squeeze value out of each dollar. The problem is that that's, and maybe this should actually go into the section of overrated. It's bottom of funnel versus top of funnel. And in marketing, that's a really important thing to understand is the funnel. When are people deciding to become your customers and how did they first learn about you? And it's not always just when they decided that matters because if you've heard about, let's just say, Two Lost distribution, everybody you know seems like they're talking about Two Lost. They're partnering with this company, partnering with that company, doing a deal with these guys. The end of like a 6 month period when you've heard a lot about them, you're not thinking about each individual partnership they've had. You're just like, wow, I hear a lot about Two Lost distribution lately. Everybody's talking about them. Maybe I ought to look into them for my next releases. That's the win.
Yeah. Is there a way, looking from the outside before you have maybe a better idea of what their business model is or how they're approaching, their process, is there a way to, better understand if this is a healthy company that is running in a healthy way versus, and I think specifically for a media company, versus if they're just loud and attention grabbing and that's what they're good at? How can you from the outside see that difference?
Well, sometimes you can, sometimes you can't, because there are companies that have like a lot of just buzzwords and they'll kind of keep adapting their model to whatever's big at the time. I think that a really nice way of identifying this, and now you can see the maybe like the late adopters or the ones who are the slowest to move away from this, but like metaverses. I don't know if there was ever really much demand for metaverses, but companies that shifted from we're doing this to we're doing that, now we're doing cryptocurrency and NFTs, now we're doing metaverses, that's generally a bad sign because they don't have one refined business model that they're really attacking. Or maybe they do. And I've actually seen it the other way where they have a really good model, but they can't get it out of their head that they want to be trending with whatever the big thing is at that time. So looking for that and then meeting with companies like, hey, how well are they able to compose themselves? Do they show up to meetings on time? Are they professional? Are they working with other people that I've heard of or even just that I have familiarity with? Are the things that they're saying, do they seem realistic? There are some companies that I found that they claim to be releasing like 10,000 hits in a year or like there's this one company, I don't know if it's worth naming names, but they've done like AI assessment of music to know if it's a hit for longer than AI has been a buzzword. And they have these claims on their website like, oh, they're working with every label, they have all of this. I don't believe it. I think it's all vapor. And so using your best judgment is really important as well.
Yeah. Is there a way that, younger people, looking at Gen Z specifically, I guess, people that are now coming into the industry or new to it, is there a way that I can look at a company that is pushing out news, and I think the way that you approach it and the way that you explain that you look at the health and validity of a company is great. And also, I don't have that kind of experience and knowledge that you do. So from my perspective, is there a simpler way or some key things that people my age can look at and be able to tell the validity of some news like that?
So, yeah, I would say so. Looking at what the chatter is online. So let's say you see a company that says that they're doing all those things I just talked about, releasing 10,000 hits in a year and working with all of the labels. And then you go onto Reddit forums that are dedicated to the music business and you see nothing about them, even just Google searching, like, is this legit? And you see almost nothing. Or you look up, is this legit? And people say no. Those are both good indicators. Something to bear in mind, though, is that with music, there are also people that may put out information that they don't fully understand. And I've seen that happen where a distribution company may get maligned for not paying artists, but it shows clearly in their terms that there's a $100 threshold. You have to earn $100 before you get a payout. And then that actually clarifies why they may not have been getting payouts. So I think that looking at the company, doing a quick Google search on them can really be informative. If you're Gen Z and you're just coming out of school and you don't have a network of people to ask around about, then start to look at the trades. If a company is working with a digital music news or even our competitors like Music Business Worldwide or Music Ally, they're reaching a very specific audience. They're not just trying to be seen by everybody. And that's probably a good testament to them actually having earnest ambitions within the music business. If they're doing all of their promotions on a social media platform that's being seen by fans of music, they may be misguided in terms of their marketing targeting, but they may also just be trying to create a big name to maybe like in their minds create a brand that they can sell and cash out. It could also be a scam. There's definitely things to avoid. I think that there are more scams in the artist space than there are for the business people who want to get involved in music. I at least haven't uncovered any scams per se. There are communities that I may not think are very fruitful, like, hey, music professionals join this community, but the cost to buy in for those is low enough to where I think that anybody who would jump into those, they may see, hey, maybe this isn't for me. And it's not going to be like a lot of money that they lose. It might be like 10, $15.
Yeah. Can you expand a little bit on, what you see on the artist side versus, speaking on the difference between what you're seeing on the music business side versus the scams that you mentioned on the artist side? I'm curious what those are.
Yeah, there's a lot on the artist side. And some of these will be like playlists where the playlist sales provider, the company that's offering to put you on playlists, they created the playlist themselves, which that violates terms and conditions of Spotify.
Hmm.
And it also may mean that there's some fabricated level of streams because if they operate the playlist, then they may control botting networks that are attracted to that. There are things that are not necessarily scams, but just bad investments. And playlists, even the good ones, are kind of being more disregarded now. And that's more of a trend on the artist side, but still worth touching on. And that it's not always because they're a scam. There's plenty of like reputable, high quality playlist providers. But when you're on a playlist, it's difficult to gain long term fans from that because that playlist, you might get a lot of streams because you're being played in like coffee shops or something, but that doesn't gravitate towards I want to listen to this person that I'm hearing right now more and more and I want to dig into their catalog. I think that there are some good things for artist discovery. There's some great artist marketing firms. There's also some really bad ones and PR firms that are just like I think they're predatory on startups. There are ones that are very predatory for artists and they will say like, "Hey, give me this much money, I'll blast you out there." And then that's just a pretty straight up scam. It's like, give me your money and trust me, bro. And they're not really trustworthy. Other ones that can be really damaging to an artist's success, though, are bot networks. Because
Interesting.
in some cases, if you get detected botting, you might be banned from a DSP and then you can't earn money on Spotify ever again. And so that can be a huge hindrance for an artist. I would say just never do anything that's botting related. There are ways to promote yourself that are low cost enough to see some return that you don't need to inflate your numbers because that's this endless game of, hey, I feel like I need to hit 100,000 on this and then 100,000 on the next one. You got to keep paying. Otherwise, people are going to notice it's an inorganic playing,
Yeah.
inorganic audience size.
Yeah. Sticking with Gen Z, um, I want to move a little bit more into maybe like skills and uh, I think skills specifically for Gen Z who are interested in music media and the music business. Starting out with, is there anything that for us now coming into the industry that there's something that we can focus on or learn or maybe do every day that would make us more employable or more effective in the industry now coming into it today?
Be persistent with everything, have thick skin, because there is going to be a lot of rejection, and that's in any field that you're looking into, not just music. And very importantly, try to understand the full breadth of the industry. Something that I didn't know before I had really gotten involved, and I don't even know if I work in the music industry now. I'm kind of like an outsider being in the news about the music industry. But there are so many more small companies than you may initially think. Everybody thinks about the major labels, and with due cause. They are very large. They have a huge amount of IP, and a lot of people know the names Universal Music Group and Sony Music and Warner. But there are, I would say that the industry is made up of the middle class companies that are three guys here, a 10-person team there, a company of 15 people out there. These are the companies that are really moving the needle in the music industry. And these are service providers, royalty administration, publishing rights, publishing administration, uh, understanding metadata. All of these niche service providers, they need people and they need talent. And I think that those are really good targets to hit. And when you're at a small company and you're providing value, you're an asset. If you're at a major label and there needs to be an executive pay bump at some point, you might get laid off just so they can pay off somebody who's already a millionaire. And that doesn't feel good for anyone, or just keep their shareholders happy. If you are contributing to the bottom line of a company, you should really be a small company that truly values that.
Yeah. Is there something that, if you are a student that feels behind or a little lost, that that student can start doing, or something that they can learn about or focus on, maybe this month, next month, the following month, that can help them with that trajectory?
I think that reading sites like Digital Music News, Music Business Worldwide, and Music Ally are really good resources because they will keep you informed of all of these different opportunities in music. And think outside the box in terms of opportunities. You may feel behind, but that doesn't necessarily reflect on anything. I didn't have like the strongest academic performance in school, but it didn't matter because for my skill set, which was sales, what mattered was my ability to make money for a company. And at this point, I should say I'm extremely happy with Digital Music News and very proud of where we are, and I'm never looking externally, but if I were to want a new position, I would not look at job boards. I would not look at LinkedIn. There might be some like good indicators on there, but what I would do is reach out to companies and say, "Hey, I just want to learn more about your business," and then see if there are ways that you can kind of like create value for them. You may find, "Hey, this label has a really cool business model that's different from others, but they just don't really have it cracked. They don't have the code cracked yet for how to make money. Maybe I can help them make money and learn everything I can from sites like Digital Music News about monetization in music and become this asset for them." You might create an opportunity for yourself in a really strong way that way.
Yeah, I think that's an awesome way to put it, and a great transition into the last section of the podcast, where I like to ask a mini case study question and a legacy question. And I think, what you had just talked about ties pretty well into the mini case study question and being a college student and how to approach something specific, but this being, a company of their own. So here's a mini case study question. Let's say I'm a college student launching a new music tech idea, maybe a platform solving a niche problem. But before I touch code or branding or investors, what are the first three things that you would make me validate from a revenue and demand standpoint?
It's if you're pre-revenue, it's hard to really talk on revenue, but are you solving a problem that actually needs to be solved? That's, I would say, it's the one question. If there isn't really a problem that you're solving, then it's going to be really hard to to gain investment unless you just have strong connections. But even then, there could be an end to the runway at a certain point if you don't have a problem that you're solving. There are some really serious problems in music. One of them, and I think this might be the greatest failing of our generation, is not getting the digital data really under our belts. Like, the music is broken into rights of the composition, that's the song, and then there's the master recording. So like um what would be why am I spacing on this? Let's say Taylor
Yeah.
Swift's Shake It Off, huge hit. There's the song Shake It Off that she wrote. It's on a pen and a pad somewhere, and somebody can make a cover of that, and it's still Shake It Off. But then there's her recording of that, which the Taylor's version or whatever the original one is. Those master recordings, they exist as their own commercial entities, separate from the composition. They intertwine, but they're separate things. The data side of that for the composition is just crazy disorganized. Every label and publisher has a different way of reporting and retaining this data. And if you have a hyphen in your name in one platform and not in the other, you may not get paid royalties. It's that complicated and that messed up. And I really think that if there were companies to truly try to master this system and say, no more of this data buildup, garbage in, garbage out. We need to actually solve this metadata issue. That could be a massive opportunity for a student who is thinking, what could I really do in music? Is fixing the publishing metadata crisis.
Yeah. So, you've developed this issue that is clearly a needed issue. How or a needed issue to be solved. How do you approach, making sure this is how do you test that this idea is going to work or that you can make money from it outside of this being, okay, I know people need it. I know this is an issue. How can I validate that this will generate revenue?
By looking at the bottom line of if this was fixed, what would be the outcome? In this case, there would be a lot more money going to the places that it ought to go. In the world of music, you get these things called the black box, which is royalties that are not being paid. They're just being held in escrow, in some cases indefinitely. In some cases, they just get liquidated and distributed based on market share. That means that the people who are already as successful as they're going to be, they just get extra money put on top of them that wasn't even theirs to begin with. And in other cases, people lose out on money forever, or they're never going to have a way of claiming it. So knowing that there is a reason to want this, you've got money that is being unpaid, people that want that money. That says, hey, I could help you make that money, and that's the way of proving it.
Yeah, awesome. And then moving into the last question, the legacy question, focusing more on you and your impact. When people look back at your work at Digital Music News and in the broader music industry, what do you hope that they say you helped change or move forward in the industry?
I don't know if I'm important enough to have moved anything forward, really. I guess that guy really made digital music news something that I paid more attention to. I guess I don't know. Like my ambitions aren't as high just because I'm. It's not like I founded digital music news, so I haven't like really made a material change. I've just monetized it and made it so that it grew substantially. But maybe people who were like, digital music news used to be. I guess this is a real example that's already happened. There are people who will talk about like, DMN used to be more in some cases like tabloidy. They were less careful about what they would publish. They wouldn't publish things that were like suspicious, but they were just more aggressive. Like, hey, this guy isn't getting paid, effing pay him or something. That's very not the tone anymore. And I think that people take it more seriously now as a byproduct of that. And that's something I can feel a little bit proud about is helping influence our editorial coverage to be a little bit more black and white.
Yeah, awesome. Well, I think that is a great conclusion to the podcast. I really appreciate you coming on and sharing your story and your knowledge about the music industry as a whole and media and business models in general. So I really appreciate you coming on.
Really, my pleasure, Nate. Anytime, I'm always happy to do it. If you want to do a part two, I'm here.
Amazing. Thank you so much. If you're listening right now and you learned something new, do me a favor, share this episode with a friend, leave a comment, and make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next conversation. We've got some incredible guests lined up from every corner of the industry, from artists to managers to executives, and I promise every episode will give you insights you can't get anywhere else. This has been BPM, Behind People in Music. I'm Nate Abrahams. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next time.